After a wee break, we're coming back with such a lovely episode, and I noticed that I'm really bright in this lighting. That was such a nice recording with Paul. I found it so uplifting and encouraging and hopeful to talk to him about so many different things. We touched on his background and journey into therapy and how it was a kind of coming home moment when he began his training and he knew that it was something he wanted to really pursue. His approach as a humanist therapist and what that entails for him, how he sits with clients and their whole self is welcome. We touched on the some of the kind of recurring themes of in his therapy of feeling too much or not enough and where the roots of that lies and how we can maybe step away from that feeling and really accept our full self as we are and how that sense of too muchness can show up in so many different ways in our relationships, our relationship with ourselves, but it can be affirmed by other relationships in our life, affirmed by our culture and what we absorb, um, but always not feeling good enough and how that links in with conditions of worth in a person-centered context of the kind of we are worthy if we are this way, and if we're anything out with that, then we're not worthy of love, care, all the things. Then we touched on the difference between affirmative therapy and explorative therapy in relation to the trans experience and how the kind of challenges around that and what that really means. And I'll kind of not go into it too much because Paul does a wonderful job at describing what that means, but really recognizing the similarities with that and what and the ways in which affirmative therapy has been misrepresented and almost misunderstood, and how, yeah, I'm not going to actually define it because I'll let you listen to it and really hear his description. And then we ended the podcast by talking about some of the barriers of accessing therapy, whether that is like in a financial barrier or it's finding therapists where you feel seen, heard, and understood. Your experience, the context of your life is really understood, and how yeah, there's different therapists who bring their wisdom and training and insight with their own lived experience to the table, and who is sometimes left out of that. And yeah, the balance of finding therapists who meet that, and also the barriers of cost, um, and some of the context around that that I feel I've never really spoken about on the podcast, which is really lovely. Yeah, I just really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I found this such a peaceful, kind of recentering conversation, and I'm really excited to be recording these episodes again. Okay, enjoy. Do you tell us a wee bit about your journey into therapy and the type of therapy you provide?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel that it was the journey into therapy was happening across my whole life, but I didn't realize that's what it was until I arrived at therapy. Because I think growing up and having my own struggles with my mental health and with anxiety and just struggling with life and knowing how to be and how to exist in the world, um, I was always aware of the fact that people struggle with mental health and with being, with wellness, and I think I kind of had this idea about myself that's like I want to in some way be able to help other people, and use my experience. And I think I got this idea planted in my mind. The way you do that is you become a psychologist, and psychologists help people with their mental health. And so I thought kind of that's what I'd have to do. But then um, my math skills are terrible, and then I had the idea with psychology, statistics. You have to be good with maths. You have to be good with numbers. So I thought, well, that's that out. Then I can't do that. That's I've got lots of skills, not that. So I guess it just sort of became a thing that I thought I'd want to do, but then was like, oh, okay, that's not for me because I can't. There's not, I need to be able to do things that I can't do. So it wasn't until I was in, in my 30s, and um, was a person that I knew called Darren who was doing his therapy training. I'd never really met anyone that was doing something like that, and he was training at the Wielden Institute, which is a private therapy training place here in Sussex, and it's very highly thought of, um, and my impression of it is it's a very intense kind of training that gives people a platform to deliver that's very thorough and very grounded in a particular way of being, which is brilliant. And so I was kind of really open to hearing what he had to say about it, because I was like, he's doing something where he really knows what he's talking about. And yeah, and I kind of told him that story of like, well, yeah, I thought, psychology, I can't do maths, that's how. And he said, well, there's also counselling, and you could just try doing like a level 2 counselling skills course, just see what you think about that. And I was lucky enough to be in the position where I had the time and the money to do that. So I thought, oh, I'll give it a try, and if it's not for me, then it's something that goes on the CV, and it sounds good, and it might just be fun. And I joined this group, and I think there were 10 of us in it, and it was once a week for 10 weeks. I think by the second session, I was like, oh, this is it. Yeah, this is my thing. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go all the way. Um, and then I think there were a few of us in the group that had that experience. Um, and then it was kind of, well, if we're going to go, then go the whole way, what do we need to do next? And then the logical thing seems to be the University of Brighton has a postgraduate diploma in counselling. And it was kind of so some people from the group went to an open day, and it was kind of like, well, if you want to get on that this September, you need to apply like last week. So then it just became this whole like, oh, okay, so we need to make sure I get onto the level 3, and I need to apply for the PG dip. I need to get a space on that, and then so it all just kind of happened. And I was convinced that it wouldn't happen. It's like, oh well, maybe I won't get as far as level 3, and I won't get a place, and I won't be able to, get the finance sorted out. But I did, and it all happened. And then I was on the course, and I did the course. I qualified, and yeah, it was kind of a surprise of like drifting around, being like, what am I gonna do with myself? And then being like, oh, I'm gonna do this. Oh, and all of a sudden, it's 3 years have gone by, and I'm a therapist somehow. Yeah, that's kind of how it happened. Yeah, so I think just happening across Darren and him saying, well, you could try this, was kind of the thing that sparked it all.
Yeah, someone giving you that guidance that is something that you can do and pursue. And then all the other kind of barriers that sometimes exist getting into counseling, the financial aspect, the self-belief, and
Mm,
you use that sentence or that experience of that's not for me. We're
mm,
maybe going to touch on that of not feeling like we're enough or we're too much or whatever that sense is within us. And then how that acts as a barrier for us pursuing the things that really could give us that feeling that you described in really early on of this is for me, this is it, this feels like it
yeah.
clicks in with maybe my experience of the world and my values, my fulfillment, my meaning. It's sometimes I feel counseling is a coming together of so many different things. It's our personal world, our professional world, our world, our humanness. Like there's so many kind of, can't think of a better word right now, levers that it pulls on. It's like a whole
Mm.
holistic experience where it touches on so many different parts of us as human beings and community and connection. And what was your experience, just to kind of tune a wee bit into that, of studying? How did you find the kind of rawness of the whole group
Mhm.
environment and the learning and yeah, that whole experience?
Yeah. So I mean, the first course that I did, level 2 counselling skills, it was just so wonderful. So we had this tutor called Jo, who was working in private practice as a counsellor, and she was what is so developed and so centered and so calming and so just able to hold space. And I was just like, this is somebody who's clearly been through a process from which they've emerged different and transformed. And I was like, I want to do this. um yeah, and so the first course I did, it was just everyone on it was just wonderful, and we just had a really great time. And then I did the level 3, and it's kind of step up in expectations, and it was more difficult, but again, just a really lovely experience. And there was more of a mixture of people who were kind of doing it for kind of an enrichment thing to do and a kind of something that might support them in their careers, and people who wanted to be therapists. Um, yeah, and then and then the postgraduate diploma, it was called psychotherapeutic humanistic counselling, and I believe it's called something slightly different now, but with the same sort of words. Um, it was the hardest thing I think I've ever done, and it was the best thing I've ever done, I think. But yeah, I think I kind of, whenever people ask me about it, I think I say it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was the best thing I've ever done, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. You know? And I think we all, the people that I trained with, we all kind of had multiple points where we were like, I'm not going to make it. I can't do this. This is too much. Um, but nearly everyone did. There were a few people who needed to leave the group for various reasons, because it's such a huge commitment of time and energy and money, and just you can't do it kind of halfway. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah, I was also working full time alongside it, and so yeah, it was tough.
so tough. Yeah, yeah, I really resonate with that whole kind of shaking up of so many parts of your life going into it. We look at maybe before we begin this journey, oh, 1 day a week, some assignments sprinkled in, eventually
Mm,
placement, and it seems like a manageable kind of step-by-step process, but actually in every step of the way, you're unpacking, unraveling parts of you, parts of your family history, your relationships. There's society, like there's so many lenses to the world that you're reflecting on and maybe shifting perspectives on healing. And yeah, I find that especially working full time alongside it, I did that throughout my training too. And at times I found it really draining. I was doing support work at the same time and then starting placement on top of that. And
mm,
just required so much of me, and so much of me showing up for others and for myself, and then learning about myself in the process. It was, yeah, like I really like that emphasis on it's the hardest thing and the most
mm,
rewarding and meaningful thing, but it's so difficult. And yeah, I think I would love that we would all have like a year of to take out for that. I really think that I wish, not even just in counseling training, but I wish we could all take a couple of years every now and again for healing. You know, oh, I'm just going on a
mm,
healing year, because it
mm,
can sometimes require so much of us to heal, and we have our therapeutic hours of healing, but then we have to kind of maybe shift back into a society or a world, the momentum of busyness or whatever it is that it can be really taxing and tough. And so we had like an almost a really concentrated experience of that in the training.
yeah.
Yeah. And where did that leave you then when you finished? So when was that you finished? I think I remember you sharing before, but yeah, for the people listening, when did you
Mm.
finish your training?
Well, what happened then was, so I graduated in June, I suppose, 2019, and then I think I just kind of had a bit of a rest and just only worked full time, which has felt like a rest from everything else as well. And then I decided to kind of, three people that I trained with, colleagues and close friends, we formed a group called Rampion Counselling and Psychotherapy, um, to just sort of practice together and keep connected. And I think the other three, Joe, Adam, and Hannah, I think they kind of stepped into private practice kind of more or less straight away. And I took a bit more time, and I started with my first private client in, I think, January 2020. So then a couple of months later, you remember COVID? You remember when that happened? So yeah, I was working with one client in person, obviously, because at that time that's the way it was. In person was counselling, um, and then yeah, March. It was something like the 24th of March or something. The whole world shut down, and that client didn't want to go online because it didn't feel right, and I was like, okay. Um, so yeah, and I was working, like employed day job, and so that shifted online. Um, and yeah, so I think it was a few months after that I then started to meet with some clients online in that very strange kind of seeing clients on your webcam from your bedroom, because that was kind of the only way it could be done. Um, yeah, so that was an interesting time. But I kind of I almost feel lucky in that I know people that joined the same course that I did a year after, and so they were training when everything shut down, and they had to go online with their training, which yeah, I can't imagine having to do that and how I would have made it through that. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, and then slowly everything started to open up, and then I started to meet with clients in person again, and yeah, that's kind of led to I work with people online or in person depending on who comes to me and what they want. I'd say mostly online. I think I've done a lot more online work than in person, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of reminded me of, when we hear about people describing generations and we hear you existed before technology or before the kind of increase of social media use and then after, because I feel like I'm in that camp of knowing what it felt like not to have a phone in friendships and younger years, and then when it Bebo and all that, and then like the boom,
Mhm.
knowing the difference. I feel like I sense that pattern in your journey as a therapist of knowing the difference of just in person and now this kind of rapid boom of online work and how that transformed the whole space for inclusivity and accessibility, but at the same time comes with challenges. I feel that could take us on a whole other journey, but of using your body versus using this part of your body, or
Mhm.
just reflecting on how it opened up a whole host of opportunities for people to try therapy because physically accessing therapy just was not a possibility for them. So it's like
Mhm.
navigating all of the challenges and the benefits to that new world. Um, yeah, and also alongside that, I was thinking, how do you describe your practice, your kind of modality? You described your humanistic, but how would you describe that online, or if you were speaking to a new client or anyone about your therapy, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how, because I think what always comes to mind immediately is humanistic, because the training that I did, there was kind of two strands to it. You could either do the humanistic or the psychodynamic group, and the first part of the day, the whole group would be together, and then for the rest, the two groups would divide and kind of go into their different modalities. And it kind of, I feel like they would talk a lot on the creators and leaders and tutors, of course, would talk a lot about how we're one group and we're training together, and but it did kind of create this like divide between the idea of either you are humanistic or you are psychodynamic. um and so, which is interesting because I guess there's a certain amount of truth to that, because there are theoretical differences in what those things mean, but at the same time, the group itself, there was a real gradient of kind of people who you could sit on either side and be with either group, and then people who were very much, I am a psychodynamic counselor or I am a humanistic counselor, depending on kind of what their attitude towards what that means is. And so, yeah, I think whenever I talk about the way that I do therapy, I'm always like, well, I'm a humanistic therapist. Um, and I think that is kind of enforced by the way that training is done, because um, when you do the training, you have to have personal therapy, or you have to, and also you really need to. Um, and the requirement would be that if you're doing a humanistic training, you have a humanistic counselor. So you have to search out somebody who is humanistic trained, describes them as humanistic, to meet the criteria of your course. So that it kind of gets further enforced. But yeah, I think there a certain amount of kind of being like, oh, I'm existentially informed, humanistic, phenomenological, I'm interested in Gestalt methods, would be kind of how I came out of the training. But now I find there's a kind of, I think a lot of counselors, therapists go through that thing of like, you get to a point where you're like, I don't really know
Yeah.
what I do or how I do this. I meet with people and I hold space for them. But I think what's interesting about that is that you come from where you're so drenched in theory and reading and learning new ways of thinking, um, that you're very aware of it, but then it becomes part of the way that you are and the way that you live. So then, as time goes by, you kind of forget how much actually is happening in the therapy room that you're kind of doing more naturally, or from a place that's not, that isn't so intellectual because it's become so embedded. um yeah, so I say I work, yeah, I would say I work from a humanistic point of view, and I see each client that I work with as a unique individual who brings what they need to bring, and I hold space for them and sit alongside them and offer new perspectives and support to transform, or go on a journey, or figure out stuff in whatever way they need to. Um, and
Mm.
it, yeah, I suppose it's my role to create the conditions for that to happen in. Mm.
Beautifully said. Oh, it's so lovely to hear you reflect on all of that and bring it all together. There's a real openness there as well around being fluid with the person with you. You know, I really love that. I definitely came from that same background of viewing the kind of person-centered humanistic approach as something that deeply resonated with me. And as I've I've kind of been kind of come into contact with all different types of modalities, I've become more kind of, oh, I love that, I love that, I love that. I'm not kind of, I move with, you know, depending on the season or the person I'm working with, or yeah, where I feel on a given day to what I resonate fully with, what I'm processing even in my own life to what I resonate with. I kind of, yeah, I love exploring all different types of modalities, and I notice, though, similarly to what you're describing about your course, that there's often like a bit of a sometimes a divide. There's sometimes people present their therapy as a kind of all encompassing,
Mm.
and others, like you said, are kind of, no, this is where I am, or yeah, there's a gradient, or there's a kind of, this is where I sit on either side. Like that, the book, the is it person-centered tribes, or that idea of
Mm.
tribes, you know, and how
Yeah.
there's connections, but there's also that kind of rigidness in their views of the world. And I guess that takes us on to exploring some of the themes, the kind of common themes that show up in the therapy room. And I know that can change season to season, individual to individual. But we touched on talking about this idea of feeling too much. And
Mm.
as I was reflecting on doing this with you today, I was thinking my curiosity always takes me into doing research and understanding types of work. So I kind of went a bit on a deep dive to remind myself what I think about these, also potentially enhance my understanding of that. And so maybe I'll share those ideas after I hear what you think, to because I want to hold space for what you think about these things before I bring that.
Mm.
But I guess I just wanted to acknowledge I've been doing some kind of, yeah, just listening to different podcasts this morning and thinking about these themes before talking to you today. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's so. I'm always a bit wary of saying, describing things as interesting, because I think it can sometimes set up this feeling of like clients being interesting to us, that I'm kind of intellectually curious about somebody, and it's a kind of way of saying it's interesting to observe as part of experiencing working with human beings. Um, but it's interesting that the words too much come up time and time again with different people that I work with in different contexts. Um, but I think I most notice it. I work with a lot of clients who are neurodivergent, usually with something like a diagnosis of something like ADHD or autism or OCD, um, or a mix and match of all of them. Um, and a lot of people are who live in that space have this idea about themselves as being too much for other people, that they're too intense, or they're too weird, or they're too emotional, or that they require too much care, or they're too complicated, and they can never have normal quote unquote relationships because they're too damaged, or they're too something, they're too much. And it's, yeah, it's, I think it's very sad that There's so many people that ingest this idea that the way that they are is too much and will cause damage or some kind of destruction to the people around them or to their relationship or whatever. And yeah, so I think my a lot of a lot of the role that I've kind of taken with that is kind of challenging it in a gentle way and questioning and being like, too much for who? Who says? Who decides what's too much? Too emotional. What's too emotional? Why? Who says that you're too emotional? Because I think there's so many different aspects to that. In that, I think people who have this idea of themselves as being too much will constellate it in their relationships and tend to end up in relationships that enforce that and become in relationship with people who give them that same message and will tell them, oh, you're too much, that's too weird, oh, you have too many emotions, you're too complicated. um, and so it kind of perpetuates itself. And one of the things that therapy can do is help a person step out of that and embrace the way that they are, um, which is a really difficult thing to do in this increasingly oppressive world that we live in.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you touched on everything that I was thinking about. The living in oppressive systems, like you said, too much to who? Like where is that coming from, and how is it being reinforced or reenacted and absorbed and sunken in even further? And I was reflecting on, well, lots of different things, but one of them was conditions of worth. Where are they coming from? How do we absorb them? What are the stories that we're holding around that? And how are we reinforcing it to ourselves in our own mind, and how much of it is us and the layers of congruence and tuning into who we are, and how much of it feels disconnected from us. And it's very, like you said, very complicated. But I was thinking about in my own life how I've moved in and out of feeling not good enough, not enough, um, and then too much. I floated in amongst all of that. I think I floated in amongst not feeling good enough, and that has meant that I've filled myself up from doing external things, always feeling like I had to show up or do more, be productive, be creative, show up for others as much as I can in my life to just, I guess, get a sense for myself that I was enough. And that I know that I can trace it back to where that came from. um, but it still was present with me. And then as I learned more about my brain and gave myself almost permission to be creative and share my ideas and turn to kind of amplify my curiosity and allow it to come out, I began to feel too much because I was like, whoa, I have so many ideas about the world and I have so many things I want to understand and work out. And it just turned the volume up on all of those things that I was potentially suppressing for a long time. I began to put the focus on me and work out who I am. And it moved me into that feeling of too much. So I was really reflecting on that from a personal level, but also how I see that in client work. And then I was thinking, okay, where did that begin to reduce? Where did the volume of that turn down? And I think it was coming into counseling. I think it was finding counselors, finding neurodivergence, finding people who, and this will take us on to our next conversation, people who affirm that part of me, people who accept that part of me, people who hold space for that non-judgmentally and don't. And then kind of the comparison piece reduced. I wasn't comparing my too muchness or not enoughness with anyone else. I was allowing that kind of freedom, and um, that doesn't mean it doesn't show up still. But I think I just wanted to share a wee bit more of that kind of personal experience around that, because I feel I was listening to a psychotherapist talk this morning with, do you know who Florence Given is?
I don't think so, no.
She is a kind of, also lots of different things, but how I found her was through activism and feminism and all sorts of things. And I'll send you it after because I feel like you might find it quite interesting. She was interviewing Todd Barretts, who is a
Oh yeah,
psychotherapist. And
follow
yeah,
him on Instagram.
what do you like him?
He's an interesting
He's
person.
interesting.
Mm.
He's interesting. Yeah. There was a lot of interesting, and that's the kind of two things in that. One is we can really resonate with some part of someone and not resonate with their full self. And I feel
Mm,
like that's really valuable to acknowledge that we might resonate with some of what's said even in this podcast, in this conversation. And
mm,
it's almost like that Buddhist concept, and it resonates with not just Buddhism, but take what fits and leave the rest, take what
mm,
resonates and leave the rest. And so that's what I was doing in this podcast when I was listening to it. And they, in that podcast at the very beginning, it ties back to what we were talking about. They ask, finish this sentence. I'm still a work in progress when it comes to. And I heard lots of therapists answer that question, everything. And it was just, I guess I wanted to share a wee bit more of my personal experience on that enoughness piece, because I think that there's sometimes pressure to be fully there and have arrived when we're therapists.
mm,
That I've had clients surprised that when it's came up in session, that I'm in therapy, and I will be, I think, in
mm,
and out of therapy my whole life. That's sometimes quite, yeah, surprising for people to hear. But I think I just wanted to acknowledge that we're always working on these things, and we can have seasons in our life where sometimes that comes up again. Like, there's that thing. And then other times the volume of it's reduced, or it feels like it's dissipated. And yeah, I don't know why I felt like
mm.
inspired to share a wee bit of that with you. And so, yeah, where does that take us now? Do you feel like there's anything else you wanted to share around that enoughness and how it's showed up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted to add about, therapists being in therapy. I think, I would say most therapists are in therapy or will go. I think um, yeah, it is another interesting thing that I think clients will sometimes be surprised by the idea that therapists have therapy, but
Mm.
I think it can only be a good sign that that the person that you're doing the work with as your therapist is doing their own work. Um, yeah, like I haven't had my own personal therapy since I did my training, but I think I probably would have if it hadn't been for COVID, kind of like compressing everything and making everything more about survival. And
Mhm.
I'm sure that I will. Yeah, like you say, probably. I don't foresee a time in my life where I think, oh yeah, I'm done now. We'll never need therapy again. um,
It can
yeah,
be quite interesting to try different types of therapy too. I found
yeah,
that, like, different ones I've heard of, and I'm like, oh, I wonder what that experience is like. Just to surrender into someone's support too can be a really nice change from our role.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd really like to try EMDR because I find it a really interesting thing in that to read about it, it kind of sounds like it's made up and like you're like flashing lights and but apparently, oh, not apparently, but it really works. And I know people that have had experiences of it and have said it's the only thing that helped me with certain aspects of my mental health. So I'm kind of like, yeah, it's in my reaction to it being like, sounds like rubbish,
Yeah.
but it's not. So like it'd be interesting to have my own experience of it, see what it can do for me.
Yeah, I've heard that skepticism before for sure.
Mm,
And I probably came into my first experience of EMDR with that. And I had a existing relationship with the counselor that I was seeing for talking therapy, and we shifted into EMDR. So we had an existing relationship, which I feel added a kind of foundation to really relax into the process rather than coming into it really, I don't know, fearful or anticipating going into that. Because I think
mm,
because it's kind of deep trauma work that we often bring into those types of therapies, I feel like we were saying earlier, like it would be nice to take a year out to do some of that therapy because
mm,
it can be quite,
yeah.
it can kick up things that we then have to go into our week with or our day with. But I remember being very surprised at how emotional it made me. Like very
Mm,
surprised at the emotions that came up, that felt very different to just the talking therapy that I'd experienced with the same counselor. So yeah, maybe that will be something you go into and try.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it will. Yeah, I think I also wanted to add about the idea of being too much is, I think we kind of touched on it, the thing of like it being reinforced by the relationships that people get into. And I think when people are in a space of not valuing themselves, then that can prevent them from getting into healthier relationships that do affirm the way that they are. And that's a really important step, is finding ways to enter into relationships where people, you know, for me it's always been one thing has always been, oh, I'm too sensitive, I'm so sensitive about everything. And now I know lots of people who love how sensitive I am, and will kind of almost look to me as the kind of the canary in the mine to be like, well, how does Paul feel about this? Because that'll give us an idea about what to feel about it, because yeah, so kind of, yeah, tuned into everything in a way that can be really overwhelming. And so that, and yeah, understanding that aspect of it is another important step on the journey.
And have you noticed that when you're around others who see that in you and tune in with that part of you, it lessens the feelings of being too much or too sensitive? Or do you think that's an internal piece? I guess I'm thinking about how that being around others who see that and accept that and actually honor it and celebrate it, it makes us feel more accepting of it within ourselves.
Yeah, it definitely kind of dissipates the idea of being too much.
Yeah.
And it kind of, for lots of people I know, is almost kind of like a joke where somebody says like, oh, I'm too sensitive. It's too sensitive. Who, what, where is that coming from? Who too sensitive? What? Like, we're not doing that here.
Yeah,
um yeah, it's just like, if anything, you could be more sensitive, you could be more in touch, you could have more emotions,
that's
because
it.
yeah.
And just finding ways to kind of soothe or regulate after those really in touch moments, where how do we
Mm,
recover from really being in tune? And I think what time are we on? Because I don't want to take too much of your time, but just to
mm,
quickly add to that is I was listening to another podcast around someone who wrote a book saying that your body's not an apology. And she talks
mm,
a lot about how her experience of that and hearing other people's experience of that. And it leans into that too muchness of feeling like my body doesn't fit into the culture or the kind of systems that, and I've just never believed that just as I am, I'm enough. I think
mm,
that feeling that you've touched on, it kind of intersects with so many parts of us, the way that we feel about ourselves, our bodies, or everything. It's got, like you said, so many layers that we could keep talking about for ages. I want to touch a wee bit on your experience of working with trans clients and
mm,
people in your life, and yeah, talking about that balance or that difference between explorative and affirming therapy, and how people,
mm,
therapists, identify with that and promote their work through that lens or those different
mm.
lenses.
Yeah, I mean, this is the difficult one. This is the kind of the moment where it's like, ooh, better be really careful about what's said, because yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like it feels like it's a controversial thing to say. Like, there's so much transphobia happening in the UK and the world generally, but there's especially kind of vicious, virulent element to it in the UK, in the government, in social media, in culture generally. um, and it can be really difficult to be with it and to know what to do. um, and I think it threatens a lot of safety for not just trans people, because it's that kind of idea that, um, first they come for the most vulnerable, and then when they've destroyed them, they'll come for the next group. And it the idea that none of us are free until we are all free. um, but yeah, I think we've kind of entered this moment where trans people have been created as this monster, this enemy that is threatening. I don't know what it's threatening, because I can't really I can't really understand what it is that trans people could possibly threaten. But yeah, and I think when it comes to working with trans clients, um, which I'm really fortunate to have had experiences of. Um, I think it's there is this kind of idea that's developing in the kind of what I guess you call the therapy community of there being on an opposition almost between the idea of being LGBT, trans, affirmative, and being an explorative therapist.
Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of come out in things that governing bodies like the UKCP have published. Um, and I find it really concerning because I think there's this. I think the word affirming may have been misinterpreted because I think there's all these insidious narratives about trans people and trans accepting people and allies of the trans community that there's grooming going on, that there's recruiting, that we're trying to confuse people, especially children and young people, and trying to trans people almost to give people the idea that they are transgender. And there's this kind of idea that if someone says they're LGBTQ plus affirmative, that a client comes to them and says, "Oh, I think I might be trans," and I will say, "Oh well, we better start you on hormones tomorrow then, and we'll get you off to surgery as soon as possible." And it's utterly absurd and ridiculous. Um, and it's kind of then being contrasted with this idea that you can be an explorative therapist, who the idea of which would be to explore the idea of gender and everything that's going on in a client's life and look at themselves holistically, which is what therapy is. And it's again, it kind of creates this monster to fight against that doesn't exist. This idea of LGBTQ plus affirmative therapists as people who are recruiting and doing something insidious, and that these other therapists need to provide a space where people are safe from that. And so it kind of it's like a war has been created between these ways of approaching therapy that doesn't exist and doesn't need to happen, because all therapy is about sitting with what the client is bringing. There is no agenda, there is no bias. um yeah, there's if it's not my job to tell a client who or what they are in terms of their gender identity, their sexuality, or anything else about them. Clients, they tell me, they tell us who they are, and it's for us to listen and to hear and to give them space. um yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's what I want, to be heard by people.
Yeah, I think you've given me a really clearer picture of the differences, although they feel quite inextricably linked, explorative
Mm,
and affirming. When they're seen as separate, there's a kind of divide, and one is misinterpreted as a pushing in, a pathology, a kind of, yeah, a pushing in of, and one is kind of like, let's explore all the things. And it's
mm,
really sad that that breakdown of understanding can happen in the therapy space, that the more that we're, I guess, we have public forums to discuss things on social media, the more, yeah, just challenge and kind of misunderstand. We miss each other sometimes in our description of things, especially in kind of short form content. That might take us into a whole
mm,
nother world, which maybe we could come back to. I really, if you ever want to come back and talk about these things further, I would love to. Um, but I do think that that kind of short form content encourages more of these kind of miscommunications and things, and fear mongering, and just zapping at parts of our brains that click with just one word messages, that creates fear, that creates
mm,
that kind of, yeah, just especially if someone clicks on something and then the algorithm just gives all of that to them, especially
mm,
around yeah, all of the things that you just discussed, that the message can get blurred and fear can happen. And it's often used in these kind of sensationalizing children, or yeah, it just is, it's surprising and deeply sad the way that it has been shaped by social media and the media as a whole, and what issues have been tuned in on. you know, last couple of years around toilets. And I mean, deeply important that someone has
Mm,
the free will to feel safe and comfortable to use a toilet. But what is missed in that conversation around mental well-being, and there's so many things that are missed when we tune into these things,
mm,
um, and it kind of loses the meaning as a whole. I think it's really important you've highlighted that, and I think it highlights the importance of language as well as
mm,
discussing what we mean by words. You know, I think that we use words quite a lot without realizing how they're landing with other people. I've
mm,
been really mindful of that when I worked with young people a large part of my life and then moved into therapy and worked with young people too. I work with a range now, but I remember young people sharing with me, I remember when you said that 5 years ago, something I would have said, and I've completely forgotten. But it's
mm,
been so important to them in the moment, and it's landed. It's happened to me, you know, listening to people in my life, and it's just landed at a moment where I really needed to hear it, and it's become kind of cemented in my view of something. And I think that that's why I feel like language is so important. What we say and how we say it and how we want to be perceived by what we say, I think is really, really important. I know that takes us off to another thing, but I guess
mm,
it reminded me of it when you were describing that, because we're finding us ourselves in a space where therapists are really online now, and they're describing their
mm.
work, they're describing therapy, the therapeutic process, and so it's important. And so how would you describe yourself in amongst what you've shared?
Yeah, well, I guess it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think what I felt mindful that I should say is that, you know, um, this is not an attack on anybody. That, you know, if someone wants to identify themselves as an explorative therapist, we don't need to be in opposition to each other. We don't. That doesn't need to be a fight that's happening. Um, yeah, and I suppose, yeah, I think would always have had said that, you know, I'm an LGBTQ plus affirmative therapist, and I never would have really thought about that before. But now that this kind of confusion is happening, it feels like I need to be more mindful about how I would describe myself. But I still, you know, affirmative means accepting and open and holding space. It's not about pushing an agenda or saying, "Oh, I think you're probably this," or "You should identify this way," or "This is what you need to do with yourself and your body if you had these feelings."
Mm.
It's affirmative in the sense that it's not oppressive and it's not um, denying the existence of trans people, of LGBTQ plus people.
No, I think you explained that beautifully, and really kind of I can see why it's been misinterpreted too with the context that you've gave, which is sad. At the context of the media and where we live
Mm,
around that, I can see why it's been misperceived, which is very sad, and potentially creates a wee bit of fear, and maybe prevents, if someone is in that fear, maybe prevents them seeking out specific therapy. What I'm thinking about in my mind when I say that is parents of young
mm,
people, because that's been my space at points, um, where I've worked with young people who are exploring gender, sexuality, and I've talked to their parents, and hearing their fear that they've absorbed that is not actually in contact with the person's experience. It's more in contact with how they've read up, or where they're at with their own understanding and awareness. So I know we're coming up to the hour. We're just going to touch on one last question if you feel comfortable continuing.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, how are you doing as we're kind of approaching the end?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's yeah, it's always amazing to me just how quickly time can pass. I'm just saying a few things and like, oh, it's been an hour. Like what? Excuse
I
me?
looked up and I was thinking, is that how long we chatted about that? I felt the same. But like I mentioned, it's been really lovely to talk to you. And if you ever want to, you have an idea of like, oh, I'd love to talk a wee bit more about that, because we can use some of what we've shared to share our thoughts on things. You know, I'll share this video with you and you can have it for yourself to, this is what I mean when I say I'm an affirmative therapist. You know, you can have those wee clips for yourself to,
Mm,
so we can do this in the future too, if there's things on your mind that you want to touch on, because we have another space that we connect. So we can maybe
mm,
chat about, oh, that's came up. Let's talk about that on the podcast. Because coming to the end, there's a couple of things, but I think we can end on either one. Yeah, did you which one do you want to answer? I've got here what are some of the barriers or misconceptions around therapy? And then I've also
Mm.
got who's been influential in your therapy journey, both professionally and personally? Anyone that you in your life or externally that you've come across that is like Darren, but anyone
Mm.
else in your life that's kind of encouraged or changed your mind on things or so yeah, you have the option, whichever one you feel drawn towards answering, we can end on.
Mm. Um, I think misconceptions and barriers is a useful thing to talk about, because uh, therapy is a very white middle class thing to do and to experience, and I think there are so many barriers for so many different groups of people, not least of all financially, because therapy is expensive, and there's lots of reasons why it's expensive, um, and I think it's easy to lose sight of that, of why it costs the amount that it does cost, because there are so many reasons, because therapists are very highly trained, and it's it's a very kind of precious thing to be able to offer the space that a therapist offers, and it takes a lot of time and development and training to be able to do that. Um, but I think that always kind of sounds at the risk of sounding like, well, we're very important people, that's why we charge you lots of money. It's more about that. It's skilled work, and it takes a lot for the person who is the client as well as the therapist. And I think the financial aspect of it is kind of like a kind of um, like a manifestation of that, of it being tough work to do. And I think that's another misconception about therapy, um, is that you kind of just talk about how you feel and it's a lovely chat. But therapy is hard work, and um, for the people that go into it and do it, I admire my clients for doing the work that they do, for being willing to put themselves through it almost. Um, yeah, I
Yeah.
think and there's so many barriers, I think, around kind of those two sorts of things, of kind of the financial aspect of it and the kind of misconception of what therapy is and who it's for and what it can do. um
Yeah, I feel like I could really talk underneath those themes for a long, long time. And just to quickly touch a wee bit on them, I think one of them I did feel starting out private practice that I wanted to kind of give a list of the things that are outgoings to clients so they could understand my price point because it was
mm,
so difficult for me to charge what I charge anyway,
mm,
because I had all the kind of self-worth stuff flooding up. I really wanted to create a private practice and enjoy all the creative aspects of it. And it took so much for me to do that. And then when I began to work out how much I would have to charge, I was thinking, oh my goodness, is this going in opposition to the reason I started therapy in the first place? Because I grew up
mm,
in an environment and in a community where therapy wasn't ever for us. It was for the people who had money and had other opportunities. So that was
mm,
coming up alongside all the outgoings that are not tied up in the price, CPD, insurance, directories. There's so much goes into the cost that we don't highlight in the way that we share our work. Um, but also, yeah, the barriers around who therapy is for, finding therapists that feel they can fully hold and understand what you're bringing, with their wisdom and training, but their lived experience and how that comes together, feeling seen in the therapy space. And um, yeah, you're that comes into class, or there's so many things that come into that, but finding people you resonate with and that you feel connected to and can build relationship with is the kind of foundation. And so if you don't see that your experience matched in the therapy space, it can be act as a really big barrier too. So yeah, resonate with all of what you shared.
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a subject that could be spoken about in a series of 2 hour long podcasts every day. So because there's so much to say, but I think, yeah, it's just, we're talking about trans community, and there are so few trans therapists because of all the barriers of becoming a therapist, and that's more intense for people who belong to a marginalized and maligned minority group, and so that's why not a lot of them can become therapists. And and there aren't enough therapists of color. There aren't enough neurodivergent therapists,
Yeah.
and it's therapists as a group are very kind of homogenous. um you know uh and it's not to say that people who belong to the general phase of therapy don't have anything to offer, and that they're just, or we all just one of those people. So, but it's we can all only benefit from a more diversified population, I guess, of people who deliver therapy.
So true. And last wee thing on that before we come to an end, we could really look at the way that the training is set up, not only the financial barriers, but I found as a kind of neurodivergent brain, the training in and of itself and the way that I could express my reflection on my practice and my learning, I found it quite limited in reflective essays and presentations. There was creative ways that we could approach it, but I definitely found that it was like an yeah, I found that throughout my whole academic experience in school and in uni and stuff too. But just like you said, I think it's definitely they're looking at it in a multifaceted way. What are the barriers and how can we meet lots of different people to support them into therapy? And that's not to say that there aren't people that have really pushed through that and got there for lots of different reasons. They've maybe accessed support or things have been in place that just allow them to. But it's been like an uphill battle. Um, yeah. Okay. Is that an okay place to end? Is there anything else you want to share before we go?
No, I think I've said everything
Yeah.
I can say right now.